The little café sat quietly on a corner of a busy street, tucked between tall buildings that seemed to stretch forever into the sky. Its windows were slightly foggy from the cold outside, and the warm light inside spilled out onto the sidewalk, inviting passers-by to come in and escape the chilly wind. People walked by in a hurry, wrapped in thick coats and scarves, their faces hidden beneath hats and gloves. Inside, though, the café felt different. It had a soft hum of chatter, the occasional clinking of cups and plates, and a warm smell of coffee and pastries that made it feel cozy and alive on this particular morning. A man pushed the door open and stepped inside. He wasn't someone who immediately caught attention in a positive way. His clothes were old, faded, and a little worn at the edges. His shoes had seen better days, and there was a small patch missing from one of his gloves. He looked tired, not just physically, but as if life itself had weighed heavily on him. He moved slowly, scanning the café as if unsure where to sit. Most people didn't notice him at first, too busy with their conversations, laptops, or morning routines. But some sharp eyes caught him, and a few guests quietly snickered behind their hands. He walked to the counter and ordered the simplest drink on the menu, a black coffee without any sugar or cream. The barista looked at him briefly, hesitating for a moment, unsure whether to smile or just stay neutral. She decided to smile politely. As he paid, he handed over a few coins and some crumpled bills. It wasn't much, but it was enough. He then glanced around the café, finally spotting an old piano in the corner. It was slightly dusty, but well kept, a classic upright model that had clearly been there for many years. He slowly made his way over and sat down on the small wooden stool in front of it. At first, no one paid much attention. People continued talking, laughing, and typing on their laptops, but a few guests had started whispering. "Who's that?" One woman asked her friend, trying to stifle a giggle. "He looks, I don't know." "Out of place," her friend replied, smirking. A man near the window shook his head slightly, his lips curling in a quiet laugh. The energy in the café subtly shifted. Where there had been a relaxed warmth, now there was a thin layer of judgment. It wasn't malicious, not exactly, but it was enough to make the man at the piano notice. He didn't seem angry. Instead, he simply looked around. Letting his eyes meet a few curious gazes before turning back to the piano, he ran his fingers lightly over the keys, almost as if testing them, and then sat still for a moment. The laughter continued in the background, soft at first, then louder as one of the younger guests dared to make a joke. "Hey, do you even know how to play that thing?" he called, grinning. A few others laughed, egging him on. The man at the piano didn't respond immediately. He just looked down at the keys, his expression calm, almost peaceful. It was clear he had heard it all before, the jokes, the whispers, the doubts. He didn't need to prove himself to them yet. Not yet. The café staff watched quietly. Some were unsure what to do. The barista glanced over at the man, then at the laughing guests, and back again. She wasn't sure whether to intervene or let things unfold naturally. It was a delicate moment. The man didn't seem threatening, but the laughter was beginning to draw more attention. More people were looking now, some curious, some amused. One older man in the corner shook his head and muttered under his breath, clearly disapproving of the behavior of the younger crowd. "Some people have no respect," he said quietly. Then, almost as if sensing the tension, the man at the piano spoke. "May I play one song?" he asked softly. His voice was gentle, but it carried a quiet authority, a calmness that immediately drew attention. The room fell slightly quieter. Some people raised their eyebrows, surprised that someone so quietly dressed could speak with such composure. The young man who had joked before shrugged. "Sure, go ahead," he said, still smirking, thinking this would be even funnier once the man started. The café waited, the clinking of cups slowing, the hum of conversation fading. Something in the air had changed. The man closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. He let his hands hover above the piano keys, not rushing, not forcing anything. The café grew silent, the laughter disappearing entirely. Even the staff stopped what they were doing, unsure whether they were about to witness something ordinary or extraordinary. He placed his fingers on the keys, gently at first, like a whisper of sound. It was soft, delicate, almost fragile. Some people leaned forward in their seats, trying to understand what they were hearing. Others just stared, unsure of what to expect. As the notes continued, they grew slightly stronger, more confident. The man's fingers moved with a kind of natural elegance that could only come from years of practice. He didn't rush. He didn't show off. Every note seemed to tell a story that no one in the cafe had expected to hear. Some people's eyes widened. A few held their cups a little tighter, listening more intently. The soft, emotional melody began to fill the room, cutting through the small layer of judgment and curiosity that had hung over the cafe. The air felt warmer somehow, more alive. People who had been laughing now sat in silence, unsure of what to say. Their initial assumptions began to crumble, replaced by something more human: wonder, surprise, and a quiet admiration. They had thought this man was just another stranger, someone to judge and forget. But the music told a different story. It spoke of experience, of struggle, of something deeply personal. Even the young man who had dared to joke now looked slightly ashamed. Realizing that his laughter had been misplaced, the man continued playing, letting the melody flow naturally without trying to impress anyone. Each note carried a weight of emotion, gentle yet powerful, simple yet profound. People began to lean back in their chairs, letting the music wash over them. Some closed their eyes, letting themselves be carried away. The room, once full of chatter and laughter, had transformed into a quiet, almost sacred space. The piano, old and familiar, became a bridge between the man's world and everyone else's. For the first time in that morning, the cafe was truly alive, not with noise, but with feeling. People who had been strangers moments ago shared a collective experience, all because of one man and his music. The initial judgment, the laughter, the whispers, all of it faded into the background. There was only the melody, steady and unwavering, and the presence of the man who had dared to simply be himself. By the time the last notes of that first song faded, the cafe was silent for a heartbeat, as if no one wanted to break the spell. Then slowly, a few people clapped, softly at first, and then with more confidence. Some people even stood, moved by what they had just witnessed. The man at the piano opened his eyes and gave a small, humble nod. He didn't say anything, didn't ask for more applause, didn't look for recognition. He simply sat there, letting the moment exist exactly as it was, and in that small cafe, on a cold morning, something changed. People had come expecting a normal day, maybe some coffee, maybe some conversation. Instead, they got a lesson in humility, in patience, and in the power of simply allowing someone to be themselves. The man hadn't needed to prove anything with words. His music did it all. And though most of the guests hadn't realized it yet, they had just witnessed the beginning of a story they would not forget anytime soon. After that first soft song ended, a small, surprised silence hung in the cafe. People had been caught off guard. They weren't expecting anything like this from the man in the worn clothes who had just walked in. Some were leaning forward slightly, their eyes fixed on him, still processing what they had just heard. Others whispered quietly to their neighbors, unsure whether they should applaud or just sit there in awe. The warm hum of the cafe had shifted. The atmosphere was no longer casual chatter, but a quiet curiosity, mixed with a hint of respect, but not everyone was impressed. A few guests, particularly a group of younger visitors sitting near the back, had been expecting a laugh. They had come to the cafe with a sense of entitlement, thinking of themselves as discerning and clever, ready to make fun of someone who didn't match the elegant surroundings. When the man had played the first song, their amusement had been replaced with something they didn't quite recognize. They exchanged glances, shrugging and chuckling nervously, trying to mask their confusion. One of them leaned over to another and whispered, "I didn't expect that at all." The man at the piano didn't react to their whispers. He had clearly heard it all before, the mockery, the judgment, the sideways looks. He simply rested his fingers on the keys again, taking a deep breath and closing his eyes. The air around him seemed to calm, as if his music was creating a small bubble of focus that separated him from the judgmental chatter. The cafe staff watched closely, uncertain whether this moment would turn magical or awkward. One of the baristas, a young woman with a gentle smile, whispered to a coworker, "I think he's about to show them something they'll never forget." One of the young men, trying to regain control of the situation, cleared his throat loudly. "So, you really think you can play something good?" he asked with a smirk. His voice carried a mix of challenge and mockery, the kind of tone that expects the other person to fail. A few others laughed, quietly at first, then a little louder, enjoying what they thought would be another funny moment. "Go on, impress us, old man," one of them said. The laughter spread, a few rolling eyes here and there, as if to say, "Let's see what he's got." The man didn't speak. He didn't need to. Instead, he leaned slightly forward, resting his hands lightly on the piano keys. There was no hesitation, no nervous glance at the audience. His posture was calm, almost regal in its quiet confidence. The first note he struck was soft but deliberate, like a gentle tap on a closed door, inviting the world to listen. Then came another note and another, each one flowing naturally into the next. It was not a flashy display of skill, not an attempt to show off, but a melody that carried an undeniable honesty. Slowly, the room's attention shifted. The whispers faded as people realized this wasn't just a casual tune. The notes were precise, filled with emotion, and somehow spoke to the heart in a way words could not. The group of young guests who had been laughing began to look uncertain. Their smirks faltered as they noticed how the music touched others around them. A woman sitting near the window covered her mouth with her hand, trying to hold back a tear. An older man, who had been quietly observing from a corner, nodded slowly, appreciating the depth of what he was hearing. Even the barista paused mid-step, holding a tray of cups. Captivated by the melody. The laughter that had been so easy just moments ago now felt wrong, almost shameful. The young man who had challenged the pianist shifted in his seat, his confidence wavering. He wanted to laugh, to maintain his bravado, but the sincerity of the music made it impossible. It was as if the piano itself was telling a story that these young people hadn't expected to hear. The melody was gentle, almost hesitant at first, but it grew stronger with each passing measure. It carried a quiet power, not loud or aggressive, but firm and undeniable. People began to lean closer to the piano, their curiosity overpowering their initial amusement. They were no longer thinking about appearances or judging the man. Instead, they were listening, fully present, letting the music guide their emotions. Some closed their eyes, letting themselves feel the story that the notes were telling. Others watched the man's hands, moving effortlessly across the keys, each finger seeming to know exactly where it belonged. The room had transformed. The casual café had become a space of focus and attention, all eyes on one man and his piano. The young man who had laughed the loudest was struggling to maintain his composure. His friends whispered among themselves, unsure of how to react. One of them muttered, "I guess maybe we shouldn't have laughed." Another nodded, saying quietly, "Yeah, he's really good." They all looked down, suddenly self-conscious, realizing that their initial judgments were shallow and unfair. The man at the piano didn't look at them, didn't need to. His music spoke louder than words ever could. As the song continued, the melody grew more complex, yet it remained deeply emotional. Each note seemed to carry a memory, a feeling, a story of a life lived through struggle and resilience. The people who had been quick to judge were now silent, captivated by the beauty unfolding before them. A few guests wiped tears from their eyes, overwhelmed by the unexpected intensity of the performance. Even those who had come to the café with little interest in music were now leaning forward. Entranced, as if the piano had cast a spell over them, the man played without hesitation, without seeking approval, without showing off. It was not about impressing anyone. It was about sharing something deeply human, something that connected him to the people in the room in a way that words could never achieve. The initial laughter, the mockery, the snickers, all of it had vanished. In its place was a quiet respect, a shared understanding that sometimes appearances could be deceiving, and sometimes true talent could appear in the most unexpected places. By the time the song reached its end, a soft, almost reverent silence filled the café. People held their breath, not wanting to break the moment. Then slowly a few hands clapped, hesitantly at first. The applause grew louder, spreading from table to table, until the entire café was clapping, cheering quietly, celebrating the unexpected gift they had just received. The young man who had laughed the loudest looked down, a mixture of embarrassment and awe on his face. He realized how wrong he had been to judge someone based on their appearance alone. The man at the piano didn't speak. He simply nodded slightly, acknowledging the applause with quiet humility. He didn't seek praise, didn't ask for recognition, and didn't demand attention. He had given them something far more valuable than words or a performance. He had given them a moment of truth, a glimpse into the power of talent, patience, and authenticity. The café had been changed, not just by the music, but by the realization that everyone carries unseen stories, unseen struggles, and unseen gifts even after the clapping faded. A sense of awe remained in the room. People returned to their conversations, but the energy had shifted. They spoke in softer tones, glanced at each other with a new understanding, and occasionally looked back at the piano with a mix of admiration and curiosity. The young group who had been laughing earlier now whispered among themselves, reflecting on their own assumptions and the way they had judged someone unfairly. Some silently promised themselves they would never do the same again. The man stayed seated at the piano, hands resting lightly on the keys, a calm smile on his face. He was not seeking revenge or validation. He had simply shared a part of himself through his music, and the world had responded in kind. The café, once just a place for coffee and chatter, had become a space of learning, humility, and connection. People realized that sometimes moments like this appear unexpectedly, and if you are willing to listen and watch, they can teach you something about life, kindness, and human nature. The song had not only silenced mockery but had transformed it into respect. Laughter and judgment had been replaced with attention and appreciation. The man at the piano had reminded everyone, without saying a word, that true talent and true worth are often hidden behind appearances. And for the first time that morning, everyone in the café felt a little closer, a little more human, and a little more aware of the stories that every person carries within them. After the first song had ended, a strange and quiet energy lingered in the café. People were still absorbing what they had just heard. The laughter that had greeted the man's entrance and the small jokes that had followed were now completely gone. The atmosphere had changed. Something had shifted in the room, though nobody could exactly say what. Even the hum of the coffee machines and the soft clinking of cups seemed quieter, as if everyone was waiting for what would happen next. The man at the piano didn't rush. He simply rested his fingers lightly on the keys, closing his eyes for a moment as though gathering his thoughts. There was no showiness in his movements, no urgency. Yet there was a quiet confidence in the way he held himself, a calmness that seemed to command the attention of everyone in the room. Even the staff behind the counter paused in their work, unsure whether to continue serving or simply watch. The barista, who had observed him closely from the start, whispered to a colleague, "Something tells me this is going to be unforgettable." The young group who had mocked him before shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They had come to the café expecting amusement, perhaps even to make fun of someone who looked out of place. Instead, they had been confronted with something much deeper: talent, emotion, and a presence that they couldn't ignore. One of them fidgeted with a napkin, avoiding eye contact, while another whispered, "I didn't know he could play like that." Wow. Their previous bravado was gone, replaced by a mix of curiosity and hesitation. Then, slowly, he began to play again. The first notes were softer than before, delicate and hesitant, almost like a gentle question to the room. But as soon as the melody started to flow, it became clear that this wasn't just a simple tune. Each note carried weight, each chord seemed to tell a story. The music was quiet at first, soft and almost shy, but it gradually grew in complexity and emotion. People leaned in, instinctively drawn closer, as though the piano was speaking directly to them. There was something about the way he played that made the room feel smaller, more intimate. Despite the café being filled with strangers, it felt as if everyone present shared a private experience. The melody moved slowly at first, with pauses that invited reflection. Guests who had been busy with phones or conversations found themselves putting those distractions aside. They were not just listening, they were feeling. The music seemed to touch something inside them, something they hadn't realized they were longing for. The young group at the back could no longer ignore what was happening. One of them whispered to another, I think we were wrong to laugh at him." The words hung in the air, unspoken but understood by everyone. The smirks had disappeared, replaced by serious expressions and a quiet sense of regret. Their laughter had been superficial, a reflex of insecurity and pride, but the music had stripped it all away. Now, they were confronted with raw honesty that couldn't be faked or dismissed. The man didn't rush his performance. Each note, each pause was deliberate. It was not a performance for applause or attention. It was as if he was sharing a piece of his soul with everyone in the room. The people who had come expecting casual conversation and morning coffee were now caught in a shared, almost sacred moment. Some guests closed their eyes, letting the music wash over them. Others watched the man's hands move across the keys, marveling at the precision and emotion in every movement. A woman sitting near the window rested her chin in her hand, mesmerized. She could feel the melody in her chest, a vibration that seemed to echo inside her own heart. Next to her, an older man quietly nodded, appreciating not just the music but the way it connected everyone in the room. Even the barista, standing behind the counter, leaned forward slightly, watching, captivated, almost forgetting to breathe. It was as if the café itself had been transformed into a sanctuary for emotions, a space where judgment and noise no longer mattered. The young man who had challenged the pianist earlier could barely contain himself. He wanted to look away, to regain some sense of control, but he couldn't. The music was too powerful, too honest, to ignore. Each chord seemed to cut through his defenses, reminding him that he had been too quick to judge. A quiet shame crept over him, but it was accompanied by a growing admiration. He realized that he had underestimated the man entirely. He had thought this would be a moment of mockery, but instead, it was a lesson he hadn't expected to learn in a cafe on a normal morning dot. As the song continued, the melody became richer, deeper, and more layered. The man's fingers moved gracefully, effortlessly, as if they were part of the piano itself. Every note carried a subtle emotion, sadness, hope, longing, and resilience. The melody ebbed and flowed like a gentle tide, drawing the listeners in, holding them captive with its sincerity. Some guests sat quietly, absorbing every detail, while others whispered softly to one another, sharing thoughts about how moving the music was. The room seemed to breathe with the music. Every laugh, every whisper, every judgment that had existed moments ago had faded into nothingness. In its place was focus, empathy, and a profound connection. Strangers were now sharing a moment that felt deeply personal, as if the man at the piano was speaking directly to each of their hearts. The music didn't just fill the room, it filled the space between people, creating an invisible bond that no one had anticipated. The young group at the back sat silently, humbled. They had thought this was going to be easy, something to laugh at, but now they were witnesses to something extraordinary. One whispered, I didn't know anyone could play like that. Another nodded slowly, adding, yeah? It's like he's telling a story with his fingers. Their eyes stayed fixed on him. Fully aware that their earlier judgments were completely misplaced, the man's expression remained calm, serene, almost meditative. There was no trace of arrogance, no hint of showing off. It was not a performance for applause. It was an offering, a quiet gift to everyone who was willing to listen. Every note felt deliberate yet effortless, full of emotion but never overwhelming. The melody carried a quiet strength, a reminder that talent and depth are often hidden beneath simple appearances. Even the café staff, who had seen many people come and go, felt the weight of the moment. The barista quietly stepped back, letting the music fill the space, feeling a sense of awe she hadn't expected. One of the older waiters, usually reserved and focused on his tasks, leaned against the counter, quietly shaking his head in admiration. It was clear that this was not just an ordinary performance. Something rare and human was happening, something that transcended age, status, or appearance. The song continued to grow, reaching a level of emotion that seemed to touch every listener differently. Some felt a pang of sadness, others felt hope, and some even felt a quiet joy they hadn't realized was missing. The music spoke of life itself, its struggles, its beauty, and the unexpected ways in which people can surprise us. The man's hands moved with grace, effortlessly conveying feelings that words could never capture. Each chord resonated deeply, leaving a mark on the hearts of everyone present. By the time the song reached its final notes, the room held its breath. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. The air was thick with emotion, a shared understanding that they had just witnessed something special, something rare and genuine. The music had silenced mockery, erased judgment, and created a connection that couldn't be described in words. People were no longer strangers. They were participants in a moment of pure human experience. Slowly, a few hands clapped, softly at first, as if afraid to break the spell. Then more hands joined, and soon the entire café was clapping, some standing, some wiping tears from their eyes. The young group who had laughed earlier now looked humbled and amazed. They understood, in a way they hadn't before, that appearances can be deceiving and that talent and depth are often hidden where we least expect them. The man at the piano didn't respond to the applause with words or gestures. He simply gave a small, modest nod, acknowledging the room with quiet grace. He didn't need recognition. His music had already done more than any words could. The café, once ordinary, had become a space of reflection, awe, and shared humanity. The people inside had learned something profound sometimes. The greatest gifts come from those we least expect, and true talent often arrives quietly, asking only for the chance to be seen and heard. By the end of this performance, every guest in the café had changed in some way. The initial laughter, the casual mockery, the judgments, they were all gone. What remained was a sense of respect, humility, and a reminder that people's worth is not always visible at first glance. The man at the piano had not only played music, he had taught a lesson about patience, understanding, and the value of looking beyond appearances. The café was quiet, almost holding its breath. After the last song had ended, a soft, lingering hum of emotion filled the air. People looked at each other, unsure how to respond at first, still digesting what they had just witnessed. It wasn't just music. It was a story, an experience that had touched each person differently. The young group who had laughed before sat in stunned silence, exchanging glances that were no longer full of mockery but of awe and embarrassment. They had expected a moment of humor, maybe some amusement at someone they assumed was insignificant, but instead, they had experienced something far more profound. The man at the piano remained seated, his hands lightly resting on the keys. He didn't smile in a boastful way, nor did he seek attention. He simply allowed the silence to settle, letting the moment exist exactly as it was. There was a calmness about him, a quiet strength that seemed to radiate through the café. It wasn't just his talent that drew people in, it was his humility, his quiet presence, and the sincerity that each note carried. The room had shifted completely. There was no room for mockery anymore. Every guest felt it. Slowly he began to play again. This time the melody was richer, fuller, and carried an intensity that was different from the first two songs. It was not louder in volume, but heavier in feeling, as if the music itself had grown wiser and more emotional. Each chord seemed to resonate deep in the hearts of the listeners, and even those who had been distant or distracted before now leaned in, captivated. The song told a story of struggle, resilience, and the quiet beauty of life. People felt as if the man was speaking to them directly, without words. Only through the language of music. The young group at the back could no longer hide their admiration. One of them whispered, almost reverently, I didn't think anyone could play like this." Another added softly, It's like he's telling his life story with every note." They were no longer thinking about appearances, clothes, or first impressions. All their judgment had vanished, replaced by awe. The man's music had stripped away their defenses, leaving only honesty and emotion. The café staff watched in quiet wonder. The barista, who had been pouring coffee and cleaning tables all morning, had stopped moving entirely. She leaned against the counter, eyes fixed on the man, captivated by every movement of his hands. Even the older waiter, usually reserved and professional, had stepped back, letting the music dominate the space. It was clear that something extraordinary was happening, something that went beyond a simple piano performance. It was a lesson in humanity, patience, and understanding. Delivered without a single word, the melody flowed naturally, growing in intensity and complexity. Each note was deliberate, each pause thoughtful. The man's hands moved across the keys with grace and confidence, telling a story of hardship, endurance, and quiet triumph. Guests felt emotions they hadn't expected to feel in a cafe on a regular morning. Some felt sadness, remembering personal losses. Some felt hope, inspired by the strength in the music. Others simply felt connected, as if the room had become a shared space of human experience. The young group, who had started the morning with laughter and mockery, were now humbled. One of them whispered to a friend, "I can't believe we laughed at him. We were so wrong." Another nodded, adding, "Yeah. He's amazing. We shouldn't judge people by how they look." Their expressions were a mix of respect, shame, and admiration. They had learned a lesson without anyone telling them directly. The music had done it all. As the song reached its climax, the man's hands moved faster, but never rushed. The melody built layer upon layer, each note adding depth and emotion. The cafe seemed to transform with the music. Every corner, every table, every person was connected by the sound. Conversations, whispers, and distractions were gone. There was only the music and the people who were letting it touch them. It was a rare moment, one that made even the most skeptical guests pause and reflect. Some guests were moved to tears. A woman near the window quietly dabbed her eyes with a napkin, trying not to disturb the moment. An older man sitting alone at a table had his eyes closed, head slightly tilted, clearly feeling the depth of the music. Even the young man who had mocked the pianist earlier had tears forming in his eyes. He couldn't look away, and he couldn't stop the emotions rising within him. He had thought this was going to be a joke, but now he realized it was a lesson in humility, respect, and the power of human expression. The man didn't speak, didn't smile, and didn't seek applause. His focus remained entirely on the piano, on the music, and on the story he was telling through it. Each note carried layers of meaning, and it was impossible not to feel something. Guests could sense the years of experience, the struggles, and the moments of joy that had shaped the man's life. The music wasn't just entertainment. It was a message, a connection, and a reminder that appearances are often misleading. Slowly, as the final notes approached, the cafe was completely silent. No one whispered, no one moved. Even the sounds of cups, machines, and footsteps seemed to fade away. It was as if the entire room was holding its breath, waiting for the song to end. And when it did, there was a pause, a long, profound pause where everyone remained still, as if trying to absorb everything that had just happened. The music had left a mark, an impression that no one could ignore. Then, softly at first, hands began to clap. One guest clapped, and then another, until the entire cafe joined in applause. Some people were on their feet, some were wiping tears from their eyes, and some were simply staring at the man with wide, astonished eyes. The applause wasn't just for the music. It was for the story, for the courage, for the honesty, and for the reminder that everyone has something valuable to offer. No matter how they appear, the man at the piano finally looked up, acknowledging the applause with a small, humble nod. He didn't speak, didn't seek attention, and didn't ask for recognition. His purpose had already been fulfilled. The cafe, once filled with laughter, chatter, and casual judgments, had been transformed. The space now felt warmer, richer, and more alive. Every person present had been touched in some way. Whether they realized it or not, the young group who had mocked him earlier was now silent, thoughtful. One whispered, "We shouldn't judge people like that." "Ever," another nodded. "Yeah. He taught us more than anyone could have." They looked down at their hands, embarrassed but grateful. They had expected a joke, but instead, they had received a lesson that would stay with them for a long time. Even the barista and the older staff members felt changed. The cafe had become more than a place to serve coffee and pastries. It had become a place of learning, reflection, and shared humanity. The man at the piano had reminded them that talent and depth are often hidden, that judging someone based on appearances is never wise, and that everyone has a story worth hearing. As the applause slowly faded, a quiet calm settled over the café. People returned to their tables, but their conversations were softer, more thoughtful. Some looked at the man at the piano, now sitting quietly, and realized that they had witnessed something extraordinary. A normal morning had turned into a remarkable experience. A story that would be remembered long after the coffee cups were emptied and the pastries were eaten. The man at the piano stood up slowly, giving one last nod to the room. There was no rush, no flourish, just a quiet acknowledgement of the moment. He walked toward the door, his steps measured and calm. Guests watched him leave, some with tears, some with admiration, and some with a deep sense of humility. The café had been changed, even if subtly, by the presence of one man and his music. By the time he disappeared through the door, the café returned to its normal rhythm, the soft hum of machines, the chatter of guests, the clinking of cups, but the energy was different. It was lighter, warmer, and more reflective. Guests exchanged glances, silently agreeing that something special had just happened. The music had left a mark on everyone, reminding them to look beyond appearances, to appreciate quiet talent, and to recognize the humanity in everyone they meet. In that small, ordinary café, a lesson had been taught without a single word. The laughter, mockery, and judgments of earlier had been replaced by admiration, respect, and a shared sense of wonder. The man at the piano had shown that true skill and true worth are often hidden, waiting for a moment to be revealed. And for everyone who witnessed it, it was a morning they would never forget. The café had returned to its usual rhythm, the soft hum of the coffee machines, the quiet clinking of cups, and the low murmur of conversation, but something about the space had changed. The energy was different now. People weren't talking loudly or laughing carelessly. Instead, they spoke softly, glanced around thoughtfully, and occasionally looked toward the corner where the piano had been played, as if trying to capture the memory of what had just happened. The man who had transformed their morning had left, but his presence lingered like a warm, invisible light. Guests reflected quietly on what they had witnessed. Some leaned back in their chairs, sipping coffee slowly, their minds wandering through the music they had just heard. Others whispered to each other, sharing the emotions that had arisen while listening. One older woman whispered to a friend, "I never expected to feel so moved in a café. He made us all stop and think." Her friend nodded, adding softly, "Yes. It's amazing how someone can change a room with just music." Even those who had initially mocked him were now silent, humbled by the experience. The young group who had laughed earlier were sitting quietly together, looking down at their hands, faces flushed with embarrassment. They had come in expecting entertainment at someone else's expense, but instead they had received a lesson in humility. One of them finally spoke, voice soft and thoughtful. "We judged him so quickly. Just because of how he looked, I feel awful about it." Another nodded in agreement, whispering, "Yeah. He showed us something we'll never forget. He taught us more than we realized." Their earlier bravado had vanished, replaced by a deep respect and a new understanding of human nature. Even the café staff felt the shift. The barista, usually busy and distracted, leaned against the counter, reflecting on the moment. She realized that every person who came into the café carried a story, something that could surprise or inspire if only they were given the chance. The older waiter, who had quietly observed from the back, shared a small smile with a colleague. "That was something special," he said. "Not just the music, but the way it touched everyone in the room. I don't think I've ever seen anything like it." The music had left more than just an impression, it had left a lesson. The café had witnessed the power of talent, humility, and authenticity. People had laughed, judged, and underestimated someone, only to discover that there was more beneath the surface than anyone could see. The man at the piano had not sought recognition or reward. He had simply played, allowing his gift to speak for itself, and in doing so, had reminded everyone present that appearances are often misleading and that every person has a story worth hearing. Some guests began sharing stories of their own, quietly, almost reverently. A young woman near the window spoke to her friend about her own experiences of being judged unfairly. An older man at a corner table reflected on the mistakes he had made in underestimating others. People began to connect in a way they hadn't before, as if the music had opened a space for understanding and empathy. The café, once just a place for coffee and conversation, had become a space of learning and shared humanity. The young group who had mocked the man earlier were particularly affected. They realized that they had been quick to laugh at someone based on a superficial impression, and it had been a mistake. One of them quietly said, "I think we should be more careful, more aware of how we treat people. You never know what someone can do or what they've been through." Another nodded, adding, "Yeah? He made us feel a lot of things in just a few minutes. That's powerful." Their tone was sincere, and it was clear that the experience had left a lasting impact on them. A few guests tried to imagine the man's story. Who was he? Where had he learned to play so beautifully? How had he become so skilled yet so humble? Questions filled their minds, but the answers didn't really matter. The experience itself had been enough. The man had shared a piece of himself through music, and that gift had been enough to leave an impression that would last far longer than any conversation or coffee would. The café seemed to feel the change too. The warmth in the room was different now, not just from the coffee and sunlight through the windows, but from the collective human experience that had taken place. Strangers were now connected by something invisible but powerful, the memory of the music and the realization that they had all witnessed something extraordinary. Even after the man had left, the sense of awe remained, like a quiet echo that would not fade. Some guests began to talk softly about the emotions they had felt while listening. One person mentioned how the music had made them think of their own struggles and triumphs. Another said it reminded them of the importance of not judging too quickly. These conversations were different from ordinary café chatter. They were reflective, thoughtful, and filled with newfound respect for the man at the piano, for each other, and for the lessons life could teach if people took the time to notice. The lesson was clear: everyone has value. Everyone has hidden depth, and every person has a story that deserves to be heard. The man at the piano had reminded them that judging someone by their appearance is never fair. He had shown that true talent and true worth are often quiet, humble, and waiting for the right moment to be revealed. The café guests understood, in a way that words could not fully capture, that they had been lucky to witness this. Even after the café returned to its usual routine, the energy lingered. People were kinder to each other, more patient, more observant. Strangers smiled at one another in small, unexpected ways. Conversations were softer, more genuine. The memory of the man at the piano had created a ripple effect, reminding everyone that a simple act, whether it's playing music, showing kindness, or simply being authentic, can leave a profound mark on those around them. The young group who had laughed earlier remained quiet for a long time. They finally began to discuss how they could change the way they treated others. "We were awful to judge him," one said. "I don't want to do that again. I want to pay attention to people, listen, and not assume things." Another nodded, adding, "Yeah. We can't always see what someone's capable of at first glance." That was a huge lesson. Their faces were serious, thoughtful, and genuinely affected by the experience. The barista continued her work, but she carried herself differently now. She smiled more, spoke more kindly, and noticed more about the people around her. Even small gestures, handing a cup of coffee, helping a guest with a menu, felt more meaningful, as if the music had reminded her of the humanity in every interaction. The café had not only been touched by the man's music, but by the lessons it carried, and the staff were quietly changed as well. By the end of the morning, the memory of the man at the piano had settled in everyone's mind. They would remember the moment not just as a beautiful performance, but as a turning point, a lesson in humility, respect, and human connection. The laughter and mockery that had greeted him earlier had been replaced with admiration, awe, and understanding. The café had witnessed a transformation, not only of a single person's performance, but of the hearts and minds of everyone present. In the quiet moments that followed, some guests reflected on their own lives. They thought about how often they judged others too quickly, how often they overlooked talent and kindness, and how often they missed the hidden stories behind the people around them. The experience had opened their eyes in a subtle but profound way. They realized that life is full of unexpected moments, and if you pay attention, those moments can teach you lessons you will never forget. Even after the man had left, the café felt different. The chairs seemed warmer, the sunlight through the windows brighter, and the conversations more meaningful. The energy in the room had shifted, carrying with it a quiet but lasting lesson. Every guest who had been present had been affected, some consciously, some subconsciously, but all had felt the impact of what had unfolded. The story of the man at the piano would stay with them. They would remember the way he had arrived quietly, unassuming, and then shared a gift so powerful that it changed the room. They would remember how laughter had turned to silence, how mockery had turned to admiration, and how judgment had turned to understanding. They would remember that a person's worth is not always visible at first glance, and that sometimes the quietest people carry the most extraordinary gifts. In that small cafe, on an ordinary morning, something extraordinary had happened. A lesson had been taught without words, a story had been told without speaking, and hearts had been touched without even realizing it. The man at the piano had come, played, and left, but his presence remained in every thoughtful glance, every quiet smile, and every reflection in the minds of the café guests. The memory of that morning would live on, a reminder that life often surprises us with beauty, talent, and lessons when we least expect them. And so, as the café returned to normal, people carried with them a sense of awe, gratitude, and humility. The laughter and judgment of earlier had vanished completely, replaced by reflection, respect, and a deep understanding of the power of quiet talent and human connection. It was a morning they would never forget, a morning that reminded them that every person has a story, and every story has the power to change hearts.